All right, welcome back, guys. We're doing chapter 12 today, and we're going to talk about some of the things that happened from about 1812 until about 1820 with President James Monroe and with President Madison. And we're going to talk about just a couple of things in this chapter because I want you to kind of follow a couple of really specific threads rather than try to get the entire chapter. Because for your test, when you test on this, you will have questions from really kind of the more specific parts of the chapter. So we're going to jump right in and we're going to start. And if we look at the first slide, it says the War of 1812. And so in kind of coming up to 1812, the British and the French are still at war. We think back to 1898 when we talk about the quasi-wars with France when John Adams was the president. But really the French and the English have been fighting for hundreds of years, off and on. And so now we have the War of 1812, and the British and the French are fighting each other, not in the War of 1812, but before the War of 1812. And just in the first decade, from 1800 to 1810, the French captured more than 6,000 American sailors. Now, how are they capturing American sailors? The U.S. Navy is very small, and these sailors are on merchant ships. Their job is to take things from the United States and sell them to England, and sometimes from the United States and sell them to France. Of course, if you are England, you don't want France to be able to buy things from the United States. And if you are France, you don't want England to be able to buy things from the United States. And so they're capturing American sailors and making them serve in the British Navy and in the French Navy. And in addition to that, the British are giving weapons, guns, to the Indians, the Native Americans on the western part of the United States, just in the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. And so the Americans are frustrated. And so what do? Well, James Madison is the president, and James Madison declares war on England in June of 1812. And really in the beginning, we don't have any navy at that point. And we have the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy is so strong, and the United States really doesn't have much of a navy. And so really in the beginning, we Americans believed this is going to be simple. We're going to march into Canada and we're going to defeat the British troops in Canada, and the British will be afraid of losing Canada and they will surrender. But it wasn't that easy. The commanders complained of their American troops. They hollered for water half the time and whiskey for the other half the time. So it wasn't initially, in the beginning, very easy. So looking at the next slide, the Americans did very badly in this war. They're losing the war in the very beginning. And they're just having a really difficult time winning this war. So the British strategy is to set up a blockade along the coast of the United States. And they do that. And that we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that they do is they go into Washington, D.C. in 1814, and they burn the White House. Now, there's a picture that we'll get to that picture in just a minute. And you can go to that picture now if you like. But they burn the White House, and the story is that the president's wife, her name was Dolly Madison, that she was cooking dinner, and the dinner was warm, and the British came, and the Madisons, James and Dolly Madison, have to flee, have to run away from the White House, and the British come inside. They eat the dinner that the Madisons were about to eat, and then they burn the White House down. Now, of course, most people don't think that Dolly Madison was really cooking dinner. She had slaves for that. But it is true that the British came about dinner time and that the Madisons had to flee. So this war, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this war, but I do want you to know that this war began in 1812 and it ends in 1814, 1815, and the end of the war is with the Treaty of Ghent. And the Treaty of Ghent is essentially, it makes no difference to it was exactly the same in 1810, or almost exactly the same as it was in 1820. As far as the British were concerned, we didn't really solve any problems. We just decided, well, the British are going to stop fighting with us. But the big thing about this war, and this is important because a lot of Americans believe, we learn that this was the second war for American independence, meaning that the British were trying to come in and take control of the United States again, but they didn't do it. And so at this point, Americans feel much, much stronger about their country. So if we go to the next slide, it's results in America. And initially, a lot of people during that war, the War of 1812, they called this Mr. Madison's War. The president was Mr. Madison because they don't understand it. There's a lot of resistance. A lot of people don't want to be at war. They can't see this war. It's mostly taking place in Canada and in the Great Lakes near Michigan, one of the first maps that we saw. But Madison is from Virginia, so some of this war is taking place in the north, and Madison is from the south. And so why is Madison fighting a war in the north when he is, because does he care about the north? And this is kind of what Americans are thinking at the time. And so they have this idea, many Northerners have this idea, to make it so that the president can only be the president for one term. And a term of president for the president in the United States is 4 years. And so many people wanted to make this so it was just a one term. And at this time, there was no limits on how long a president could serve. George Washington served only for 2 terms, but there was no law against becoming president more than 2 times until the 1940s, after President Roosevelt ran and won 4 times. He's the only president ever to be president more than twice. And so their idea was that the president could have only 1 term. No 2 presidents in a row consecutively could be from the same state, because so far we've had a lot of presidents from Virginia. George Washington's Virginian. Now, John Adams is from Massachusetts, but Thomas Jefferson is from Virginia. So we've got Washington, Adams, Jefferson. Madison is from Virginia. The next president, Monroe, is also from Virginia. And so of the first 5 presidents, 4 of them are from the same state. And also, the Northerners wanted to get rid of the 3/5 clause. Now, the 3/5 clause was something in the Constitution that said that 3/5 of the slaves could count as population. Now, that was important because the more people you have, the more government officials that you get to have. And so the South wanted to count those slaves. Of course, the slaves can't vote, but they do count as population. And the Northerners wanted to require 2/3 of Congress, not half, but 2/3 of Congress to vote to declare war and admit new states. But the North, this fell apart. The North was not interested in this. And then after Jackson won, person who becomes President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, wins a victory in New Orleans, the Federalist cause kind of loses support, and this idea that we're going to amend the Constitution kind of loses support. And then James Monroe, also from Virginia, is elected president in 1816. Now, if we look at the next slide, you can see he's Democratic Republican, and now that's the party of Jefferson. He's in office from 1817 to 1825, and his Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams becomes president. Now, we're going to look at the next couple of slides, and we got a lot of kind of picture slides in here, so we're going to look at these pretty quickly, but I want you to go to the next slide, and it's a map of the United States in 1808, after the presidential election. And so what we're going to do is look at this one, and then I want you to look through these, spend 4 or 5 seconds on each one, and then I want you to notice, as we go to 1812, watch the country grow. Watch it expand westward with each new election. Then we move to 1816. And then we move to 1820, and you can see all those new states are being added. Americans are pushing to the west. And then finally we have 1824, and then now we have not just 2 political parties, but we have more than 2 political parties. And we actually have several political parties up to this point, but we don't become just a 2-party system until about 1840. We talk about that in a later chapter. So after the War of 1812, and this is an important moment. So in this chapter, in this lecture, we're talking about two things. One is the War of 1812, and one is the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise is very important because what we have now in 1820, now let's go to the next slide, and I want you to look at this map. What we have in 1820 is a new state that wants to join, and that state is Missouri. Now, if you look in the middle of what is now the United States, look in the middle of that, you see Missouri Territory. All of that wasn't Missouri. We have to carve a little piece out of that and make it a state about the same size as all of those other states. But Missouri has slaves. And at this point, we have equal number of free states and slave states. And so how do we break that balance? So if we have 11 slave states and 11 states that don't have slaves, then we have government officials from both sides trying to decide to make law. We're going to have problems. And so Missouri wants to become a state. And what do? Thomas Jefferson talks about this, and he writes a letter, and he says to the person he's writing to in the letter, he says, "This wakes me up like a fire bell in the night, like a fire alarm in the middle of the night. You wake up." And he feels like it's going to destroy the country. And so what is the solution here? Well, the solution is we can let Missouri join as a slave state. And then way up in the northern corner, we let Maine, if you look up in the top right corner of that map, you'll see Maine. It's partially pink and partially dark pink. And Maine can join as a free state, so no slaves in Maine, and will allow slaves to be in Missouri. And they did another thing. They drew a line. If you can look at that map, and you look at Tennessee and North Carolina, and then the division between Arkansas and Missouri Territory, see that line runs pretty much straight across. And so the agreement is that no slaves could be in any place above or north of that line, except in Missouri. And that below that line, you could have slaves. And so that gray area, that's not the United States at this point. This belongs to Spain. And so we now have this new territory that can be slave or not slave. Now, we look at the next slide, and we see another map, and you can see a little bit more. You can see ultimately what Missouri looks like. It's now orange, and then below that is Arkansas. And that blue territory north of Missouri, north and west, no slaves. No slaves can be there. So you can see the next slide after that has a large map with that. So go ahead and have a look at that and just study that map for a moment. As you're studying that map, I want you to notice that this gray territory, who does that belong to? Well, part in the top left corner, that's kind of in dispute between a couple of countries. But the gray area on most of the left side of the screen, this belongs to Spain. And so Spain is also colonializing Central America and South America. And the United States is there. And how does the United States fight against a large country like Spain, and even England and France, for that matter? So James Monroe he creates this doctrine, this policy, in which he says that the United States, we're going to not get into European wars unless European countries threaten American interests. Now, American interests could be trade, could be American citizens, could be anything that the United States has a financial or interest in, or national security interest. So, he also said that the American continent, so North America and South America, and of course Central America in the middle, are not open for European settlements or European colonies. And Americans would interpret any attempts to come into these continents and these lands as an unfriendly act, meaning essentially an act of war. So after the War of 1812, moving into 1820, after the Missouri Compromise, right around the time of the Monroe Doctrine, Henry Clay has this kind of puts forward this idea. Henry Clay is an American lawmaker. He helped make laws. And he puts forward these ideas, and he believes, and we're going to only talk about one of these because the one is kind of the gateway into the next couple of chapters. But he believes that there should be taxes, protective tariffs, taxes that prevent other countries from selling things to the United States for cheaper than Americans can sell them to themselves. He also believes in a strong banking system, a national bank, for example. And he also believes in roads and canals. Now, who doesn't believe in roads and canals? If we're looking at this American system slide and you think roads and canals, who doesn't believe in that? But look at the next slide. We don't have very good roads and canals. If you live in New York City and you want to travel to New Orleans, Louisiana, which is kind of at the bottom of the map, if you look at Florida and then from Florida you move to the left, that's about how long it takes to travel, 4 to 5 weeks to travel from New York City to New Orleans, Louisiana. That's in 1800. Look at the next slide, 1830. That time has been cut in half. And this is because during that period, after the War of 1812, the Americans designed and built new canals, new roads, and we really were just starting to go into railroads. And so travel time gets much, much more easy. And the market economy, looking at the next slide, the market economy begins to develop. And Europe, after the French and British stopped fighting, and the French really were fighting with all of Europe for the first 10 or 15 years of the 1800s. And after Napoleon is out of the picture, and after Europe kind of stops fighting with itself, they begin to buy more American products. And American sailors don't have to worry now about being kidnapped or stolen and forced to serve in the Navy of another country. And also, a really important invention here is the cotton gin. The cotton gin takes cotton, so your clothes are made out of, many of your clothes are made out of cotton. And you have to, that cotton grows on a plant, and the plant has to be, you have to pluck the cotton bulbs off at the top of the plant. But inside that cotton bulb are seeds, and you have to take the seeds out of the cotton fiber. And so many slaves would take so much time taking the seeds out of that cotton fiber until a man named Eli Whitney in 1793 invented something called the cotton gin. And it's a machine that takes those seeds out of the cotton. So 1 pound of cotton per day that a plantation can produce, can clean, suddenly becomes 50 pounds per day. So a massive amount of increase that these plantations can now produce in cotton. Riverboat travel down the Mississippi, on the Missouri, on the Ohio, on the Tennessee, all of these rivers, riverboat travel is increasing, and tobacco and cotton are being transported on those riverboats. The Erie Canal, and we're going to see a map on the next slide, the Erie Canal is built, and that connects New York State. If we look at the next slide, we see a slide of New York State. You can see all the waterways in New York State. And really, the Erie Canal connects the left side of the map to the right side of the map. It's a waterway that runs all the way across from east to west in New York. If that looks kind of like a boot, if you look at the toe, where it says, on the left side of the toe, it says Tonawanda. All the way over, straight across to the right, you will see the Erie Canal. Today, it doesn't connect all the way, but it used to connect all of the way to the Hudson River. And then from the Hudson, it would come down to New York City and then to the Atlantic. Look at the next slide. This is the state of Georgia, and that's in the southern United States. New York, of course, is in the north. Look at all the waterways. Look at the next slide. This is the state of Tennessee. Tennessee is where I am, and Tennessee is just above Georgia. So Tennessee, I live only about 5 minutes from Georgia, so I'm very close to Georgia here. The next slide, this is Kentucky, and Kentucky is right above Tennessee. So we have Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, all right north to south. But what I really want you to see on these is all of the waterways. The next state is North Carolina. North Carolina from Tennessee is east of here. It's the eastern border of Tennessee. Look at all those waterways. This is Pennsylvania. This is right below New York State. again, you got lots and lots of waterways. So for businessmen who were looking for ways to make money, they're looking at the waterways. This is Michigan. We always know Michigan in the United States because it looks like a hand with a thumb. This next one is Wisconsin. This is the last one. This is Wisconsin. Again, so many waterways. Wisconsin says it is the land of 10,000 lakes. The next slide is still market economy, and we can see from 1840 to 1860, we can see the growth of the railroad tracks in the United States. So it's not just canals and rivers, it's also roads and railroads. And you can see that by 1840, there's nearly 3,000 miles of railroad track. And in English, when we say RR, that means railroad. That's the train, the hocha, the train that on the railroad tracks. So by 1860, just 20 years later, we have more than 30,000 miles of railroad track. 1840, 3,000 miles. 20 years later, 30,000 miles. So massive growth just in those 20 years. If we look at the next slide, we see also railroads, and this is how many railroads existed by 1850. And then the purple lines are railroads that were built between 1850 and 1860. We can see a lot of those are in the western part of the United States. And then once you get to Chicago and St. Louis and New Orleans, north to south, there's not really any roads. That's kind of the western border, the western frontier. You really don't go past Chicago unless you have someone that knows how to navigate in the forest and the woods. The next slide, we can see the population growth. This is percentage of slaves. And we can look at, you can study that. If you want to, you can pause for a little bit. You can pause this, and I want you to study this map for just a moment and notice that the deeper concentrations, the more dense concentrations of slaves are along the river and along the ocean. And the river, you look at Mississippi and Louisiana. The Mississippi River runs north to south, and lots of slaves on that river. And then the next slide, we see population increase, and gradually, over the decades, the population gradually moves further and further west. And you can pause and you can look at this also for just a moment. Just take a couple seconds and study this if you need to pause. By 1830, all Western residents lived in by 1830, 75% of people that lived in the western part of the United States, they lived in one city, New Orleans, Louisiana, Cincinnati, or Pittsburgh. 3 cities. They live in those 3 cities. By 1840, only 20% of people live in those cities, which means that so many more people have gone west, so many more people. Industrialization begins, factories, railroads, and the rise of the middle class, meaning that more people have jobs, more people have free time to spend doing other things, and more people have money. And so with these things, as people become more mobile, America changes, and this is largely because of how Americans thought after the War of 1812. And the American system, one part of which was to develop better roads and better canals. So we're going to stop there for this chapter, and I'll see you again in chapter 13. So you guys have a great day or great evening, and look forward to seeing you next time. All right, bye-bye.